Is it possible to take control of a drone by spoofing the GPS signal it receives? How big was the disaster we narrowly avoided in Constanța? A few days ago, I gave an interview for Agil Press. I talked about how recently it was discovered that Russia tested a military system that can jam all GPS signals from space. You can watch the first part of this interview. In the second part, I invited Octavian Berceanu, the former head of the Environmental Guard, to explain what he thinks happened in Constanța. Honestly, my discussion with him scared me. I realized that we were only 20 or 30 meters away from a huge disaster. Only the fact that the drone wasn't controlled well enough and ended up turning left a few dozen meters earlier saved us from a truly major disaster. I invite you to watch both parts, and if you're not interested in the first part, you can skip directly to the second part, the disaster we narrowly avoided. This new article reveals that the public GPS signal systems in Europe, as well as in Canada and North America, are, how should I put it, vulnerable. Or that they can be affected by jamming carried out by Russian satellites. The article shows how the measurements were taken at many stations in many locations across Europe, including Romania, and that jamming was observed at the same time in the same way at all the stations, and from there it was possible to precisely deduce the source of the jamming. And the researchers normally expected the jamming to come from the ground because methods like that have existed. The signal would normally come from radio sources, radio antennas, yes, transmitters on the ground, but this time it was coming from space. And it couldn't have come from the ground because that signal reached both Canada and Europe. A ground source with such a wide reach was unlikely. And anyway, they were able to locate the source. The source was from space, and not only that. Knowing when that event took place, there were several such events, if I'm not mistaken, about 75 events. But in some of them, they were able to locate the source. As you said, where and when in space, with an accuracy, if I'm not mistaken, of a few meters. And then they searched the satellite databases and discovered a Russian satellite that travels in a very elliptical orbit. That means it gets close to Earth from time to time. And that satellite was at that location at that time. That's where the suspicion came from, indeed, now very strong about what they tried to do. The Russians tried to test this jamming system against public GPS systems in Europe, Canada, and America. With that, first of all, it must be said that Russia did not exaggerate, that jamming only lasted a few seconds. Yes, and it wasn't at a very high level, meaning not much higher than the interference that happens during solar eruptions, which lasts much longer, sometimes up to 100 seconds. The jamming done by Russia was stronger, but how should I put it? It was kind of like a signal you use to test if the system works, right? Then you make it very short, a few 4 seconds, 3 seconds, yes, that jamming, so that in general, yes, those of us who were driving cars through Europe, for example, maybe we lost the signal for 3 or 4 seconds. It's like we were driving under a passage or inside a tunnel. So they made sure not to affect us too much, because of course if it had affected us too much, there would have been conflicts. Diplomatic, but on the other hand, it's clear what Russia is trying to do. And once again, I don't know if they are the only ones trying, because I suspect that the Americans might also try, or the Chinese. Anyone with an army would want to see how well this jamming system would work, so that they can then use it in case of a war, and how should I say, an economic war maybe, and so on. Yes, so it's about testing a new military technique, because that's what we're talking about, jamming from space this time, not from the ground, yes, and testing this military technique. Not to use it now, but to have it in your portfolio of military techniques that you could use in the future, of course with much greater efficiency. It depends a lot on technology, and you realize that for me, for example, or for an ordinary citizen, it won't affect us very much, except maybe we might lose our way. Because we rely on GPS, but we're people who drive cars, and if the GPS signal disappears, we don't know where to go anymore, but we keep, how should I say, following the traffic laws. I mean, we're careful where we go, even if we lose our direction. Yes, and if we don't get to the area where we need to be at the time we need to be there, it's not a big problem. If we're talking, for example, about ambulance systems that need to reach an area at a specific time, of course they will be delayed because people, drivers, rely on ambulance systems, and that's the case with all systems. If we think, for example, about smart cars, you realize that smart cars also rely heavily on GPS. I imagine they have a safety feature, meaning that when the GPS signal disappears, self-driving cars will probably pull over to the side so they don't go in a direction they don't know. If we think, for example, about airplanes, well, civilian airplanes, to be honest, I don't think they rely on just one GPS system, because there are several GPS systems, so they probably use multiple systems, safety systems that are close to the military ones. For example, they use signals from 3 GPS systems, and if one is jammed, you rely on the other 2, or at least 2, or you rely on something else for navigation besides GPS, because you have onboard instruments to navigate, right? You have altimeters, you have a compass, and so on. So I think from system to system, in some situations, especially when we always rely on the GPS signal and rely on it a lot, that's where most of the problems will be. I would say this, that first and foremost, yes, we are not in a situation where Europe has, or Russia is so aggressive towards Europe that it would want to use this system against the public system in Europe, right? Because that would be, first and foremost, a political statement, meaning a political attitude, a direct war against countries that are part of NATO, right? I don't think Russia wants something like that. So we were just dealing with a test of a system that could be used in the future. But if it will be used, yes, where will the biggest impact be and where will the greatest danger be? Essentially, that's your question. And I think the first thing we need to realize is, how should I put it, the impact on public opinion. So just by the fact that Russia could use this system to disrupt ordinary citizens driving their cars, forcing them to buy maps and navigate like in the old days, with the map in front of the car, right? This will annoy a lot of European citizens. So first and foremost, it will have an impact on the ordinary citizen, and the citizen will say, but what are we doing? We want to live in peace. On the other hand, of course, it could affect systems where GPS is essential. Here, what can I say? I don't know, maybe we're talking about drones, for example, but in Western Europe, we don't rely too much on drones, at least not yet. In the future, we might use drones for home package delivery, but otherwise we don't rely on them. And I think, on the other hand, Europe also realizes, yes, that it needs to prepare for such an event. So at least they know that such things exist, and then they will probably move into critical systems. Whether we're talking about healthcare, ambulances, or, I don't know, airplanes, as I said, towards military GPS systems. Are military GPS systems essentially more resistant to such attacks? We should first understand how a GPS system works, like the one we have in our car, right? We're talking about 3 or 4 satellites that are somewhere in space, right? And they know exactly where they are because as they move around the Earth, at any moment, they know their exact location, right? And they send a signal at the speed of light all over the surface of the Earth. Each one sends signals at the speed of light all over the surface of the Earth. When we're in a car, we actually receive, or not us, but the GPS, of course, receives the signal from all 4 satellites. But pay attention, if the car is a little more to the left, then the signal coming from the satellite on the right will arrive later. And vice versa. That means if the car moves more to the left or more to the right, the delay between the signals is different. And that signal carries not only the delay, because the delay is actually measured by the GPS, but that signal also carries the location of the satellites. And then what happens is what, well, mathematicians call a triangulation process. That is, just like you have a triangle from which 3 signals are sent, you look at how quickly the signal from each one reaches you, and if some signals arrive faster than others, you know you're more to the left or more to the right. You know where the signals were sent from since that's included, so you know your location, right? Now, what do jamming and interference mean? It means that on that frequency band where you receive your signals, you simply send random signals, a lot of signals. And then your receiver can no longer distinguish real signals from what was sent, and it gets lost. Basically, it doesn't know which are the original signals coming from the satellites anymore. So in that case, you say, okay, I've lost the signal. Yes, that's jamming. Falsification or spoofing is something completely different and much more subtle. So how does this happen? It's usually done from the ground. I haven't seen reports of satellites spoofing from afar. But from the ground, there are transmission stations, be careful, that send signals simulating GPS. Yes, so basically your receiver is again receiving 3 signals. Yes, be careful. The signals are from the same simulator and come from another direction, but the receiver can't tell their source. Because in GPS systems, normally the receiver doesn't know where the signals are coming from. The receiver only knows when the signals arrive and information about the location of the signals. Well, in a spoofing system, a falsification system, we have a GPS simulator that sends 3 signals simulating the satellites on exactly the same frequency band. But pay attention, it intensifies. The intensity of the simulation is higher than the intensity of the signal. And then the receiver listens to the real satellites and suddenly sees how a signal on the same frequency band becomes, let's say, much stronger. And it starts to track that one naturally because the signal is stronger. And by tracking that one, it starts to believe that the signals being sent are the real ones. But the signals being sent are simulated. Yes, that means they falsify the satellite's real positions and send other positions of the satellites in such a way that the GPS signal, yes, considers that it is 1 meter to the left of where it actually was. And they do it so well that if, let's say, the car should go 100 meters forward, by manipulating these simulated signals, you can tell the GPS system, okay, do you want to go 100 meters forward? It changes that location 100 meters ahead and puts it to the left. And then you say that the front is to the left and you go to the left exactly where you want it to go. Well, the spy wants it, so to speak. The one who is falsifying the data wants it. So in other words, falsification means intentionally giving the GPS system a wrong map. And pay attention, if you somehow know where that car wants to go, then you change the location. He knows he wants to get to Bucharest, right? But in the simulator, you send the Pitești location instead of Bucharest. He thinks he's headed to Bucharest, but he'll end up in Pitești. So if you know where the drone, or let's say that car, is going through this simulation, you make it arrive at another location, exactly where you want it to go. This is simulation, or, well, spoofing in English. Yes, from what I've read, and I especially read what Octavian Berceanu, the former head of the Environmental Guard, wrote, there are a lot of theories, right? Personally, I don't believe in... No, let's put it this way. First of all, the question is whether in Constanța it was jamming or it was falsification. If we follow one of the drones, because I understand there were 4 drones, one exploded very close in the port. Close to 2 things that are very dangerous, namely a nitrate tank, something like that, which could have exploded and was very dangerous. Or very close to an oil tanker, so a petroleum tank. And there were 2 more that exploded 150 kilometers from Constanța, and a 4th drone that exploded somewhere else, so there were 4. But note, the one that managed to reach the port, if indeed the trajectory I saw on the internet is correct, it seems that it intentionally went to that specific port area, because you can see how it heads toward Constanța, enters the port, and then continues inside the port. Inside, it follows that port until it reaches a location that is very close, just a few hundred meters, from two areas that would be very dangerous if there were explosions, right? If we look at that trajectory, essentially, we should already deduce that it's not jamming. Because if you jam them, those drones no longer know where to go and they start moving randomly in one direction or another. And they couldn't have such a dangerous trajectory. So then we probably have to talk, as most people say, right? That it's most likely a case of signal spoofing. Now, however, what does signal spoofing mean? It means that the Russians or the Russian army somehow took control of this drone and took it to a location where they wanted it to go. That is between the two military targets where the explosions could have been very large. Now, however, how can I take control? Note, you don't necessarily have to use that method with satellites, right? Essentially, it can be used if you know where that Ukrainian drone was headed. So if the Russians had known where that Ukrainian drone was going, they could have changed the coordinates so that it would end up exactly where they wanted, right? And they could have carried out this spoofing, but only with ground stations. Because I don't remember there being GPS simulators capable of such simulations from space. I mean, I haven't read about anything like that, so we're not talking about satellites. We're talking about ground-based simulators. Now, I don't know if the ground-based simulators are powerful enough for the Russians in Crimea to have used these simulators on that drone to change its direction. The military should know this because they should have seen, how should I put it, these effects of the simulation in other signals as well. On the other hand, there are other explanations that could be, let's say, simpler. One could be a spy, right, within the Ukrainian army, who, as I read, that Ukrainian drone was supposedly waiting for some Russian ships that had unloaded oil in Constanța, which in itself raises a question mark, and were about to leave the port. So basically, those Ukrainian drones were supposed to attack these ships that would have left the port. Or if the Russians had known, okay, they want to attack these ships leaving the port, so they probably would have known the location and time, then they could have used that method. But on the other hand, it could also be simpler things. For example, they could have taken control because many of these drones are not necessarily programmed from scratch to the target, you know? They can travel hundreds of kilometers and hit a target with an accuracy of about 3 to 10 meters. And essentially, they are programmed to do the first part of the journey on their own. But as they get closer to the target, they are generally controlled because there are video cameras. You can see which direction you're going. You can identify the target. And then in the final phase, you want to go directly toward the target. Or it could be that the Russian army intervened on this communication channel and took direct control of the drone. Yes, that they took control using conventional methods, so to speak. Yes, so again, we're not talking about them distorting the GPS signal. No, the GPS signal wasn't distorted. We wouldn't have had those GPS signal simulators, and simply the drone would have been controlled through classic channels by the Russian army. Again, I don't know if this is true, but again, it's a possibility. So the idea is that there are many classic possibilities, not necessarily yes, to immediately think about distorting and falsifying the GPS system, which, as I said, can still be done. It can be done with ground stations when the signal is known. From a military point of view, I'm thinking of a few solutions. But how should I put it? I believe that this very logic of military confrontation, yes, it's something that should be avoided. Because we are a technological civilization and we are becoming more and more dependent on technology, yes, and without wanting to, we are entering the area of the Cold War and nuclear bombs. I mean, as long as we depend on technology, somewhere on the other side, there will be someone who can infiltrate that technology and cause a lot of harm, right? But leaving aside this, how should I say, problem, which essentially is social, is about war, is political, right? Once we are in this system of confrontation where we are facing an enemy, in this case Russia, they should be looking for military measures. Well, and if we're talking about military measures, I should think, what could they do, right? Well, in this case, the public system needs to get closer and closer to the military one. I mean, the first measure is for the GPS system to use at least two sources, because we have several satellite constellations that send GPS systems, right? GPS signals. We also have Galileo, the European one, we have the American one, we have the American military one, and so on. So public systems, if we want to defend ourselves, must rely on several such constellations of satellites to avoid jamming on a single channel. Of course, after that, opponents will want to jam on multiple channels. When it comes to GPS signal spoofing, so basically, as I told you, to change where places appear to be. Then we can use another thing that's done in the military system, namely data encoding. Because the data coming from the original satellite in the military GPS system has its own security code. And then the receiver, which in this case is essentially a military receiver, checks the security code. But the other side, the opponent, in this case Russia, in order to trick the GPS system, they would also have to send that security code. And you realize that this is almost impossible. It's already at a different security level, and breaking through it would be very difficult, right? So when public systems also implement these security codes in their systems that are transmitted, then again public systems in Europe are more resistant to these data spoofing attacks. After I did the interview for Egger Press, I called Octavian Berțianu, the former head of the Environmental Guard. I wanted to know what he thinks happened with Alevara in Constanța. I'll let you watch the interview. Honestly, I was scared by how disastrous it could have been there if the system the Russians used to take control of the drone hadn't failed just a few dozen meters away.
How I see the picture given by the incident with the drone that exploded at Dock 78 in the port of Constanța on June 5th. Let's go back a week and see that 3 Turkish cargo ships were targeted on May 29th by a drone attack in the Black Sea off the northern coast of Turkey. This attack was foiled. We're talking about 3 cargo ships, 3 oil tankers, James, the second one under the Palau flag, and Altura and Velora, both under the Sierra Leone flag. They somehow managed to avoid a drone attack from Ukraine. On June 5th, when the incident happened, there was already another vessel unloading in the port of Constanța, which is under embargo. And the consequences are only handled by the Ukrainian authorities. It's about the safe in Ilona, which left Media Terminal, sometime after 9 in the morning at 9:20. Exactly at the time the drone was supposed to explode, an hour before. Off the coast during the night, I assume this ship was being awaited by a pack of drones, at least 4 drones, which were supposed to destroy it after it left the port. Somewhere offshore at 140, 150, 160 kilometers. Why offshore? And why then? Because they couldn't destroy it. If it was destroyed while loaded carrying oil, it would have triggered a huge international scandal, especially with the Romanian side. And I think the interest was for this small catastrophe to be covered up, and for the effects of the oil pollution not to be visible from the shore. They probably remained somewhere out in the Black Sea. Unfortunately, it's likely that the Russian forces are being played, as we've seen by this activity of the Ukrainian army to destroy Russian ships. And that operation might have been played out by intercepting the drones with special Russian equipment, which took over the electronic control of the drones. From what I understand, the command can be taken over through the satellite system, a Russian satellite jamming and interception system that is quite well developed. but it could just as easily be taken over by systems that are located on land or at sea. In our case, it's likely that these jamming and takeover systems are found on a commercial cargo ship, on a commercial vessel. In our case, these jamming and takeover systems are likely to be found on a commercial vessel. In our case, these jamming and takeover systems are likely to be found. In our case, these systems are likely to be found on a commercial cargo ship, on a commercial vessel. To enter the port of Constanța, complex maneuvers, not easy maneuvers. It traveled a few kilometers inside the port of Constanța, but it failed miserably just a few dozen meters away when it had to turn left toward the oil terminal. Why do we say oil terminal? Because after it turned left, after Dock 78, where that drone got stuck in the floating barrier system, which somehow limits any pollution with petroleum products, the actual oil terminal facility was located right in the area between Dock 77 and Dock 79. And what would have been the consequences if that drone had reached there? First of all, we need to talk a bit about the drone. It's a sea baby, a drone that can carry 850 to 1,000 kilograms of very powerful explosives on board, so that it can break a commercial ship the moment it hits it. What should also be noted is that these drones are equipped with fairly modern navigation systems that allow them to navigate even when they lose signal, and they also have a system for self-destruction so that these drones don't fall into the hands of an adversary. The self-destruction system means using a much smaller amount of the total explosive charge to destroy and disintegrate the drone, and not to disintegrate a commercial ship or a much larger target. Why is this system needed? Precisely because of what we've seen before. Drones can be taken over by enemies or can reach places where they generate unwanted effects for those who initially operated the drone. Like in the case of Romania, we return to the intention of entering the Constanța port into the oil terminal with a large explosive payload. Let's look at what the effects of an explosion there would have been. First of all, we need to consider a few things. In that area, there are terminals for the import and export of grains, and in our case, in just over a month, for the export of grains coming from Ukraine. Constanța port is the largest port on the Black Sea that can provide economic support to Ukraine through the direct export of grains. Secondly, oil terminal is also located there, through which Ukraine can be supplied with fuel. And thirdly, we have the port area, which also serves other commercial units, including a nearby ammonium nitrate warehouse. At the time of the explosion, according to sources, there were about 1,000 tons of ammonium nitrate in the port of Constanța nearby. When we say nearby, we don't mean a few dozen meters, but rather a few hundred meters up to 1 or 1.5 kilometers. Why was CFL Ilona targeted? Because it was specifically authorized to export petroleum hydrocarbons. But Ukraine wants this export, which may be based on Russian oil, to be destroyed. In Constanța, if this area had reached the Lukoil terminal, Lukoil at the oil terminal, then it probably would have suffered quite significant damage from an explosion within the range of the docks in that area. What is important to mention is that at that time, near the oil terminal area, there was also a cargo ship carrying 8,500 tons of methanol, which is an extremely powerful, toxic, and destructive substance when It explodes when it reacts. What would it have meant? The explosion of the existing tank at the port dock would have led to a chain explosion of the installations at the oil terminal. It would have generated a fireball strong enough to destroy any structure within at least a kilometer around. Within a radius of a kilometer, maybe a bit more, we had an excess of ammonium nitrate, ammonium 1,000 tons. And the combination of the two explosions and the two sources of explosion, extremely powerful, would have been equivalent to almost 2 kilotons of TNT. When we say 2 kilotons of TNT, we're talking about a bomb, tactica, so powerful that it would have simply wiped out the entire infrastructure of Constanța port. It probably would have brought down apartment buildings. It would have created huge craters and would have made port activity non-existent for the next few years. By a rough calculation, the equivalent, 1,000 tons of ammonium nitrate. That means about 400 tons of TNT, and those 8,500 tons of methanol mean somewhere around 1,500 tons of TNT. Stacked together, that's nearly 2 kilotons of TNT. That would have simply destroyed the city of Constanța, everything that means port infrastructure. It would have destroyed the infrastructure as well. The administrative area, everything that means the inhabited zone, and the blast from this explosion would have been felt for 7.78 kilometers. Most likely we would have been talking about hundreds or thousands of victims in that area. That's pretty much my view, that a small atomic bomb just passed right by us and we pretended not to see it. We totally ignored and are still ignoring a possible mass destruction. The damages would have been, in the medium and long term, in the tens to hundreds of billions of euros for Romania. Thank you.
Dear friends, this was today's video. To be honest with you, it kind of scared me. I realized that we really are on the border of a war where tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are dying. And that what happened in Constanța could have been very serious. If that system the Russians used to control the drone hadn't failed just a few dozen meters away, I'll leave you with that thought as well. And I thank everyone who subscribed on Patreon or who are members here on the YouTube channel. Those of you who haven't subscribed to this channel yet can do it right now by clicking the subscribe button. Until next time, I'm Cristian Presura. Fizica povestită, you are cool. I wish you all the best. Goodbye.